So here we go. We're going to try to wrap everything up with Schopenhauer in this one video, but we don't have a whole lot left to do, not a whole lot left to cover, so that should be pretty easy. This should be a fairly short video compared to the other ones. We'll see how it goes. You know how I get. Sometimes I go off on little rants. But really, we're going to focus on, just kind of tying everything together and wrapping everything up. But these quotes we're looking at, particularly this first one, give us a good idea of Schopenhauer's general view of art, and really gives you a sense of how important art is to him, and how it fits into his overall philosophy, right? How central it is really to Schopenhauer's overall thought. So let's read this quote here, right? Art is a play within a play, Schopenhauer claims. Let's read the quote and see why he says that. If the whole visible world is just the objectification, the mirror of the will, conducting itself to knowledge of itself, and indeed to the possibility of its deliverance, and at the same time the world is idea, if we regard it in isolation and freeing ourselves from all volition, allow it alone to take possession of our consciousness, is the most joy-giving and the only innocent side of life. If those two things are true, and obviously if you watched the other lectures and you were following me, he thinks that's true, right? The world is an objectification, a mirror of the will that underlies it, the will that's trying to know itself, and the possibility of its deliverance, right? It's equilibrium, it's satiation, constant tension and ebbs and flows. That's true. And at the same time, the world is idea, the world is our thought as experienced by us in our representations. If we regard it in isolation, freeing ourselves from all volition and allow it to take possession of our consciousness in this will-less, subjective state, this purely contemplative state, if that's the most joy-giving and only innocent side of life, if those two things are true, check for him, then we must regard art as the highest ascent, the more complete development of all this. For it achieves essentially just what is achieved by the visible world itself, only with greater concentration, more perfectly, with intention and intelligence, and therefore may be called, in the full significance of the word, the flower of life. If the whole world as idea is only the visibility of the will, the work of art is to render this visibility more distinct. It is the camera obscura which shows the objects more purely and enables us to survey them and comprehend them better. It is the play within the play, the stage upon the stage in Hamlet, if you're familiar with Hamlet. So let's talk about this a little bit. Right, all this should be familiar talk up until a point. What makes art so great? Its ability to bring us into this state and to experience the world as a will-less subject detached from any of our concerns or desires. Okay, this is the joyful state. It's a higher ascent that art brings us to. How does it do this? It does this by taking all those manifestations of the will that are out in the world and concentrating them, making them more potent and more vivid for us. That's what the artistic genius does. He notices this stuff in nature and he brings it forth in his work of art. And it's the play within the play, the stage upon the stage in Hamlet. Why does he say this? If you know the story of Hamlet, right, Hamlet, he knows, or he thinks he knows, that the king, his uncle, has killed his father, the previous king, and married his mother. He's not quite sure of this, so he creates a play with that exact plot, and he presents it to the king to see his reaction, right? The play within a play that reveals truth, okay? So how is art like that? How is art the play within the play? Art is like that. We're the king. I hope we didn't murder our brother to marry his sister, but anyway, we're the king in this analogy, and the play is really our representation, our experience of the world. The world is representation for Schopenhauer, right? And art brings its vividness to the fore, and we see it for what it is. This will, this underlying will trying to objectify itself in all these different manifestations of a Platonic idea. Okay, so back to the presentation. So back to this notion of suffering, contemplation, and now we're finally getting into Schopenhauer's pessimism, which he's more famous for. Remember we talked in the previous video about his connections to Buddhism and this notion of constant suffering and life itself is a constant struggle. You know, we get consolation here, but then there's more desire in the future, right? So all of our satisfactions are only temporary, okay? What does this have to do with art? The pleasure that we receive from all beauty, the consolation which art affords, the enthusiasm of the artist, which enables him to forget the cares of life, all this rests on the fact that the in itself of life, the will, that which underlies all phenomena, existence itself, is a constant sorrow, partly miserable, partly terrible. While on the contrary, as idea alone, purely contemplated or copied by art, free from pain, it presents to us a drama of full significance. Right? So life is suffering, life is dark, you know, life is not rational, it's a constant struggling, it's a constant tension. All things that exist only exist through their constant exertion of their will to objectify themselves in the phenomenal world, but yet art gives us this sort of repose. It gives us sort of consolation, allows us to sort of pull ourselves away from this constant struggle and see everything as one, as unified, as all manifestations of this one underlying will. This purely knowable side of the world, and the copy of it in any art, is the element of the artist. He is chained to contemplation of the play, the objectification of the will. He remains beside it, does not get tired of contemplating it and representing it in copies. Meanwhile, he bears himself the cost of the production of that play. In other words, he himself is the will which objectifies itself and remains in constant suffering. Right? The artist, because he can see with such clarity the world as it truly is, and the world as it truly is a world of suffering and constant heartache, constant struggle, and overcoming opposition. He has this inner struggle. He can't help, of course, to contemplate it, right? That his gift is to see it and to bring it to expression. That pure, true, and deep knowledge of the inner nature of the world becomes now for him an end in itself. He stops there. So this is as far as the artists go. This is as far as art can take us. It gives us these temporary, fleeting escapes from those struggles of life, but they're not permanent. So this is the constant struggling, the suffering artist, right? The trouble artist that Schopenhauer pictures here. I guess it's a bit of a stereotype. I'm sure some artists are like this, but he's making quite a bold assumption, right? But so this objectification of the will, and perhaps the contemplation the contemplation, excuse me, this objectification of the will in art and our contemplation of it, it doesn't become a quieter of the will in the artistic genius, right? In fact, it's maybe even a constant torture for him, right? It's not like in The Saint. We don't have time to get into Schopenhauer's concept of the saint, but he defines the saint as he's like the genius, where he's able to see the world as it is, as this constant world of suffering, but he's able to maintain through this inner disposition, I think is the phrase that Schopenhauer often uses. He's got this inner disposition to where he can access and he can always be in this permanent state of balance and contemplation and detachment and can kind of see everything all as one, right? He's attained what Schopenhauer calls resignation, okay? But again, I'm not going to get into all the details of that. It's not that important for our class, since we're focusing mainly on his philosophy of art. But with that in mind, let's wrap things up here, okay? Let's go ahead and try to finish up Schopenhauer so we can move on to Nietzsche. I still need to finish my presentation for Nietzsche, so it might be a few days before I post some of those videos. But let's get this Schopenhauer guy behind us. Although he won't be completely behind us, you're going to see when we get to Nietzsche what a big influence Schopenhauer was on him. But here are some, questions or perhaps objections that we might level against Schopenhauer and Schopenhauer's philosophy. One question that I have as I read a lot of this stuff, because I don't really like particularly his metaphysics. I think his metaphysics is fascinating, right? The idea that underlying all existence in the universe is this sort of this will with intent, right? This self-conscious active force that is guiding all the things that happen. Not guiding is even too I think strong a word, but anyway, it's this force that is somehow self-aware and it has a sort of agency. That is fascinating, but I really think it's a stretch. Right? I think it's a flimsy metaphysics. Okay, now, you might want to push back. I welcome you to it if you want to write an essay about how his metaphysics is great and we're all a part of this eternal will. Great, have at it, good luck, right? But I'm not convinced. So with that in mind, is there a way you can separate his aesthetics from his metaphysics? Because they seem to be so tied together, right? Art is beautiful insofar as it's an objectification of this will that underlies all things. All things are an expression of the will, right? This one monolithic world will, the cosmic will. And so his aesthetics is so tied to his metaphysics, it's hard to see how, can we separate the two? And if we do, right, let's say there's a way you can talk about his philosophy of art outside of the context of his overall metaphysical view, what do we have left, right? In other words, what is he essentially saying about art and our experience of art? And what I take him to be saying, if you sort of extract all the metaphysics and kind of ignore all that stuff, he seems to be saying basically that when we look at art, we're looking at ideals, right? When you look at a painting, the artist is trying to paint the perfect human or the perfect, if you're looking at a still life, for instance, it's supposed to be even better than the actual thing. So if it's a painting of a pear or a bowl full of fruit, that the fruit in the picture are supposed to be more beautiful than any fruit that's even possible in reality. So they're like the ideal. They're the objectification of what all fruit is trying to be. But it can't be that because it has all these external conditions. So art is really presenting to us an ideal, perfection, something beautiful, right? The Platonic ideal, the idea. And although I think that is somehow interesting, right, is he right about art when we think of his theory in this way? Is art, are all works of art this way? It might be true that some works of art are. I know in the Hindu tradition, now some might get offended that I call these works of art because they're religious texts, but things like the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, these epic poems in the Hindu literature, right, they're very, I lost my thread here. What point was I going to make? Oh, they're supposed to be the presentation of the world as it is, the ideal. Actually, I think really the Ramayana is that way. The Mahabharata is more as people really are. It's a little bit more realism, whereas the Ramayana, right, that epic poem from Hindu tradition is supposed to present ideal, the ideal king, the ideal mother, the ideal father, the ideal son, the ideal subject, the ideal warrior, right? So that work of art, that epic poem, is presenting this perfect ideal. And that's fine. I mean, I think that has a place in art, but is all art that? Is that all art does? Is that its only function? That's a good question you might ask. Sorry, it's about to get really loud because it's garbage day, and the garbage man just showed up outside. So bear with me for the next few moments. The video's almost over, so I hate to start it over. Last question. And this is a question you could ask about, basically any of the philosophers that we've covered. All of their theories of art seem to have something relevant to say. They seem to make some interesting points about art and our experience of art, how we understand it, how we judge it, what we consider when we're making those judgments. They all seem to make interesting points, but they also seem to exclude in their theory, because of the way they define the beautiful, because of the way they define art, they seem to exclude other art. So the last question I asked for Schopenhauer, are there works of art, like for him, that are excluded? As an example, Katie, stop scratching that. As an example, I put abstract expressionism, right? If you look at a painting of, let's say, Kandinsky, or a painting of Jackson Pollock, who some of you might be more familiar with because they actually did a movie on him. I know most of my students, I think I mentioned this in a previous video, if it didn't happen in their lifetime, they probably never heard of it. They're sort of, the cultural references I'm drawing from sometimes are a bit of a stretch, I got to admit. But abstract expressionism, a painting that's just colors, right, forms. Would this fit his description of art as presenting to us an ideal? I mean, if you see just a bunch of splashes of paint on a canvas, maybe you don't think that's art. So for you, that's fine. Schopenhauer's theory works just fine. But if you're a fan of abstract expressionism, he doesn't really seem to have much room for it. Of course, there was no such thing as abstract expressionism when he was writing The World as Will and Representation. So I wonder what he would say about it. I suspect he would be with you if you don't like it. He would say it's not art because it doesn't express the will, right? It doesn't express this underlying will. Maybe he's wrong, though. You might find a way in which abstract expressionism really does do that. Maybe the way that the colors are applied to the canvas are done in a certain way that reflects something in the world, right? It might not be an actual object that we know, but maybe it elicits a certain emotion, the way music does. Anyway, those are all interesting questions that we could ask in regard to Schopenhauer's philosophy of art. I think we've said enough about it already. This is, I think, video number 7 or 8 or so. So I'll go ahead and stop it there. And then we're going to pick up with Nietzsche. We're going to talk about Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy in the next series of videos. I probably won't start posting those. For those of my students who are watching this, I probably won't get to those for at least another 2 or 3 days. But by the end of this week, I should have most of, if not all of the videos for Nietzsche posted. And we probably won't spend quite as much time on Nietzsche as we did on Schopenhauer and as we did on Kant. Partly that's because they don't give as much of the essay. They take a lot out of it. There's a lot missing from the essay. It basically gives us the first half and cuts out the second half. So we're not getting the full essay. And another reason why we won't need to spend as much time on Nietzsche is, and I mentioned this already, he's so influenced by Schopenhauer, at least he was in his earlier period, and that's what we're looking at. The Birth of Tragedy was his first published book, so when he was writing it, he was still under the deep influence of Arthur Schopenhauer, and also a friend of his, the composer, the German composer, Richard Wagner. So we'll get into more of those details in the next few videos when we get to Nietzsche. So I better shut up. I better stop it there. I tend to ramble sometimes, but thanks for joining me for Schopenhauer. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was clear enough. A lot of material. And I will see you on the other side of